representation of rhetorica associated with Asia, passion, and excess. This characterization seems apt. Kristeva herself has often, and somewhat uncomfortably, compared her facial features to Chinese ones, as in the Samurai Possessions and About Chinese Women. Kristeva's writing, both fictional and critical, often delves into explicitly sexual imagery and topics. Her prose has been described as no less than a, quote, lush banquet. Clark suggests that rhetoric as a discipline is undergoing an internal change as it begins to accommodate, quote-unquote, strangers, particularly women. Clark emphasizes Kristeva's claim that all subjects are strangers from themselves, and argues that in understanding foreignness and strangeness thusly, people can begin a generalized restructuring of their relation to that which is supposedly alien. Clark suggests that marginality, quote-unquote, inaugurates the dialogue, for instance, between rhetoric and truth, women and power, and that acceptance of the marginal ought to be practiced on both the individual and national level. She adds that Kristeva's emphasis on the drives in linguistics and psychoanalysis mirrors the incorporation and resistance to such incorporation of rhetoric in scientific discourse, situating Freud and Lacan as highly scientific thinkers. She places Kristeva in the rhetorical turn of post-structuralism, though the historical connection between rhetoric and persuasive power discourse necessitates a distinction between the turn to new rhetorics and old rhetorics, as examined by Barth. More on that later. The distinction, one which contains a modern critique of ethnocentrism in rhetoric, yields a potentially fruitful site in which to examine Kristeva's explanation of the other. According to Clark, marginality, as described by Kristeva, avoids essentialism by placing marginal identities in the unconscious, where those identities intersect with multiple other drives and material realities. Ultimately, according to Clark, by accepting the stranger within, subjects can begin to accept the uncanny in society without. However, in contrast to Clark's more friendly reading, Lynn Warsham's Writing Against Writing predicament of écriture féminine in the composition studies, originally published in 1991, recently published 2003, considers the potential paradoxes of incorporating écriture féminine writing in the classroom, which by definition resists stratification into compositional pedagogy, since the university system is, according to Warsham, an ultimately patriarchal institution. Warsham finds unsatisfactory resolution imagining composition and teachers assuming the role of Kristeva's phallic mother and predicting commodification and containment of écriture féminine, and in doing so implicates Kristeva as a sort of theoretical collaborator to the patriarchy, though Warsham does not say so directly. Clark and Warsham write in the company of a body of rhetoricians seeking to critically redefine rhetoric's history, tradition, and potentialities, along with Barbara Basecker in Coming to Terms with Recent Attempts to Write Women in the History of Rhetoric, 1992, Cheryl Glenn in Remapping Rhetorical History, 1995, Cornelia Wells in Towards the Pragmatics, or Improvisatory Histories of Rhetoric, Eternally Ad Hoc, 2003, Jay Dolmage in Metis, Mestiza, and Medusa, Rhetorical Bodies Across the Rhetorical Tradition, 2009, and Merlin Mifsud in On Rhetoric as Gift Giving, 2013. Wells, for instance, writes that words are not only rhetoric, and that man is not the only rhetor. Women, too, all can and do dwell rhetorically. And so, perhaps rhetoric is our missing link with the other forms of life that existed not only once upon a time, but which contemporaneously are all around us, and which we also should be about. She notes that George Kennedy's 1991 translation of Aristotle's On Rhetoric includes a passage granting rhetoric to animals, suggesting rhetoric originated language. Thus, exigence may prompt speech, but intention, meaning, and audience reception may limit the purity of communication. Words will never work in the job of corresponding to objective meaning, and words and other signifiers, being rhetorical, will always play, if never fully play out. Wells proposes rhetoric as a rhetoric of communion, rather than competition. Quote, we might turn to radically multiple histories written by any and everyone, and the radically more tolerant forms of allowing and encouraging all those stories so that everyone comes along a victor, unquote. Notably, however, these rhetoricians publish in journals which blend English and communication studies, with Worsham's articles tending towards the English side of the spectrum in contrast with the others. Additionally, the French female intellectuals of the quote-unquote time of theory, the rhetoricians listed of the French intellectuals of that time, the rhetoricians listed above tend to cite Cixous before Kristeva. Still, the move towards an embodied rhetoric in order to make possible new modes of consciousness echoes for me the semi-analytic and poetically revolutionary imperative in Kristeva's work from the 1970s and early 1980s. To return to Barthes, in his Rhetoric and Aid memoir, he proposes that the semiotic project aspires to a new rhetoric, one based less in the political and more within the problematic of creating the, quote, modern text, i.e. the text which does not exist yet, unquote, and suggests, quote, one way to approach this new text is to find out from what point of departure and in opposition to what it seeks to come into being, and in this way to confront the new semiotics of writing with the classical practice of literary language, which for centuries was known as rhetoric, unquote. He would later say of Kristeva, his student become teacher in the Russellan language, 1986. Julia Kristeva changes the places of things. She always destroys the last prejudice, the one you thought you could be reassured by, could take pride in, unquote, and suggests that Kristeva's is the first critique of communication since psychoanalysis. Read together, these quotes can suggest that Kristeva's obliterating approach to knowledge could assist rhetoricians in their attempt at new rhetorics towards Barthes' as yet non-existent text. And so writing instructors who would have the modern text in their own writing, or even in that of their students, would do well to consider Kristeva more fully. Such considerations might include the Cora as the seat of invention, the Writer-As-Analysand, the challenges of bringing semanalysis, among other Kristevan concepts, into the classroom, and how all these elements come to bear on the outcome of her Diploma of Advanced Research in Psychopathology and Semiology. In order to establish Kristeva's rhetorical position regarding what is ethical within the treatment of language as psychologically transformative or generative process, one might first examine her essay, The Ethics of Linguistics. While Kristeva's writing has often been characterized and criticized as unbearably difficult, this particular essay employs a lucid structure, reinforced throughout through sentence structure, references, and content of ideas. Though these may be heavy and require slow, considered reading. She begins with a consideration of ethics. Quote, ethics used to be a coercive, customary manner of ensuring the cohesiveness of a particular group through the repetition of code, a more or less accepted apologue. Now, however, the issue of ethics crops up whenever a code, more social construct, must be shattered in order to give way to a free play of negativity, desire, pleasure, jouissance, before being put together again, although temporarily, and with full knowledge of what is involved, unquote. Ethics for Kristeva is a social construct to be both understood and transgressed against. Linguistics attempts to master a logical process, an illusory mastery which can be undermined by irony, bringing to mind travestying language, parody, and carnivalization. Poetry is one such ironic language element, being intimately connected to the body as it taps into, quote, rhythm, death, and future, unquote. Poetry is a side of destabilization and destruction, even as it draws upon feelings, thought before thought, more on this to come, and generates new ways of making meaning. Quote, no longer will it be possible to read any treatise or phonology without deciphering within every phoneme the statement, here lies the poet. The linguistics professor doesn't know this, and that is another problem, allowing him blithely to put forth his models, never to invent any new notion of language and preserve the sterility of theory, unquote. Who can read, here lies the poet, and not consider an epitaph, a tombstone? To consider language as some fixed structure without body or desire to impel it forward is to bury poetry. The joining of meaning with form, the issue of which, at its best, is meaning which, if not transcendent, surely rises somewhat above its progenitors. Kristeva then proceeds to model some analysis, rather than a semiotic analysis, of some lines by Vladimir Mayakovsky's How Verses Are Made and Electric Jack. According to Kristeva, semanalysis is a, quote, analytic discourse that by holding to the conjunction of symbolic, and semiotic is perhaps the only one capable of addressing this untenable place where our speaking species resides, threatened by madness beneath the emptiness of heaven, unquote. It both questions meaning and structure, recognizing the speaking subject, and considers art as the object used to discover the limits of positivist knowledge of language. This form of analysis would increasingly incorporate psychoanalytic language to describe the symbolic elements and bodily drives beyond the limits of science. Kristeva's treatment of Mayakovsky establishes a recurrent topic in her work, an ego, negotiating between the symbolic, oppressive father figure and the rhythmic, pulsating, desire-oriented at the mother figure. Rhythm and language for Kristeva taps into the infantile pleasure in babbling, a pleasure associated with the mother who introduces the child to this delight. The press of meaning is compared to the sun, a father image which requires that the babble be restrained by meaning, structured meaning. The recognized power of the son father figure inspires in the poet a speaking subject with fear and jealousy, desire to have that same power over others. The maternal association with desire for meaningless babble frames mother figures, and by extension, femininity as subversive and marginal. The struggle for speaking subjects to navigate between structured language and the bodily pleasures of speech plays out like a Chinese finger trap, in which resistance to the sun makes the sun burn more intensely, attempting to destroy poetic language. Kristeva asserts, quote, any society may be stabilized if it excludes poetic language, unquote. Because of the repression of the sun, poetic expression cannot exist in the moment of utterance. Instead, that expression exists in an eternal temporality. Kristeva concludes that to ethically conduct linguists, I expand this to include writing teachers, must understand the historical powers which have shaped language and make space for new meanings. New meanings emerge from the Cora, the seed of invention. In a short chapter taken from Tales of Love, Kristeva gives us succinct an explanation, as she is likely to provide, for the Cora. The Cora is a, quote, non-expressive totality formed by the drives and their stases in a motility that is as full of movement as it is regulated. Kristeva draws the term from Plato's Timaeus, quote, to denote an essentially mobile and extremely provisional articulation constituted by movements and ephemeral stases, unquote. The Cora, as a site of beginning, quote, precedes evidence, verisimilitude, spatiality, and temporality, unquote, and as such can be situated only conditionally. At this point, Kristeva provides an extended endnote on relevant passages from Timaeus, emphasizing the extent to which ideas, in coming into articulation, remain eternally uncertain. And the Cora's ceaseless reformations, in that it is the beginning which cannot then become stable, there is some order, though that order is outside the symbolic law and godless. Cora is maternal and bodily in the pre-verbal sense of energetic impulse. The symbolic imprints upon and mediates from the Cora through family and social structure. To identify this mediation, consider the subject, which has not yet been formed, before that subject performs language acquisition or even concrete operations. In this way, signification is a function of the symbolic order, as Kristeva's semiotics are functions of the Cora. The semiotic meets the symbolic as a maternal body. Still yet an extension of the undifferentiated subject becomes associated with the oral and anal drives and repressions in the sensory motor phase. Therefore, quote, the semiotic Cora is no more than the place where the subject is both generated and negated, the place where his unity succumbs before the process of charges and stases that produce him. We shall call this process of change, charges and stases, a negativity, unquote. At this point, drives undergo stases, or in other words, material experiences, such as voice, gesture, and color, which tension exists in an eternal temporality. Kristeva concludes that to ethically conduct linguists, I expand this to include writing teachers, must understand the historical powers which have shaped language and make space for new meanings. New meanings emerge from the chora, the seed of invention. In a short chapter taken from Tales of Love, Kristeva gives us succinct an explanation, as she is likely to provide, for the chora. The chora is a, quote, non-expressive totality formed by the drives and their stases in a motility that is as full of movement as it is regulated. Kristeva draws the term from Plato's Timaeus, quote, to denote an essentially mobile and extremely provisional articulation constituted by movements and ephemeral stases, unquote. The chora, as a site of beginning, quote, precedes evidence, verisimilitude, spatiality, and temporality, unquote, and as such can be situated only conditionally. At this point, Kristeva provides an extended endnote on relevant passages from Timaeus, emphasizing the extent to which ideas, in coming into articulation, remain eternally uncertain. And the chora's ceaseless reformations, in that it is the beginning which cannot then become stable, there is some order, though that order is outside the symbolic law and godless. Chora is maternal and bodily in the pre-verbal sense of energetic impulse. The symbolic imprints upon and mediates from the chora through family and social structure. To identify this mediation, consider the subject, which has not yet been formed, before that subject performs language acquisition or even concrete operations. In this way, signification is a function of the symbolic order, as Kristeva's semiotics are functions of the chora. The semiotic meets the symbolic as the maternal body. Still yet an extension of the undifferentiated subject becomes associated with the oral and anal drives and repressions in the sensory motor phase. Therefore, quote, the semiotic chora is no more than the place where the subject is both generated and negated, the place where his unity succumbs before the process of charges and stases that produce him. We shall call this process of change, charges, and stases a negativity, unquote. At this point, drives undergo stases, or in other words, material experiences, such as voice, gesture, and color, which tend to semiotization, slip and condense, therein contributing to the effectiveness of metonymy and metaphor as figurative elements. The semiotic represents a psychosomatic continuum between the unformed subject and the unformed other object. These semiotic processes and relations occur synchronically with the signifying process of the subject. Here, Kristeva seems to imply that semiotic processes may even have some biological genetic determinism within the human species. She suggests that beneath written text, semiotic rhythmic rhythm pulsates, bound only by syntax, as in Mallarmé's The Mystery of Literature, where she cites various fragments amounting to the impression that writing in words, when avant-garde, carries more meaning and rhythm, more than meaning and rhythm, having to do with the incomprehensible. The chora and the semiotic underline a resistance to any conception of a transcendental subject, since subjects come into formation through dialectic, as in language acquisition. Subjectivity for Kristeva is ephemeral and in the moment of articulation. These expressions are atopos, or no place, available for understanding in the future, not the present, limited in their psychic and accessibility. In the present, according to Kristeva, all subjects are limited to their own subjectivities, a barrier which cannot be crossed by any communicative act or impulse, not even love. Thomas Rickert explains the significance of the term chora from a rhetorical perspective, framing communication first in the contemporary context and then in the historical. Now, information technology has drawn attention to the degree to which human minds extend beyond the physical shell of the skull, blending in with the physical environment in the sense that our understanding of who we are as subjects appears at least to be in some ways predicated upon biologically external social structures and finds expression likewise. Plato's exploration of chora in Timaeus has rhetorical implications in its influence upon invention, beginnings, and rhetorical space, especially in the sense that the boundaries of speaker, writer, audience, reader, and rhetorical situation, context, are constructions of arbitrary boundaries. Rickert explains that the rhetorical, and by extension, pedagogical tradition has neglected the chora because, following Plato, Aristotle characterized the chora with the topos, or commonplaces. Singularly to do with space and matter, rather than as Kristeva's appropriation and certain usages within the Timaeus itself would place it, to do with psyche as well. Aristotle's usage is, though not without some justification, etymologically, chora, the word, before Plato used it, was used synonymously with topos and kenon, or void. Cora as a word appears to predate topos, used heavily, usually heavily tied to ecological and political geography, but also indicating social rank or position, though the term is typically used in a geographical sense by Plato. The very structure of Timaeus illuminates what the term meant for Plato. The text begins the day following the dialogue in the Republic with an emphasis on the interlocutors being of the same -1. The emergent theme is that the ideal described in the Republic as an ideal cannot be actually achieved, implying that all beginnings exist non-autonomously in a matrix of beginning, shaded by memory and a nunque or necessity. The conditional nature of beginning appears to be tied to the imperfect nature of creation, relevant to post-structuralists and the implication that this imperfection has on signification. The Cora exists at topos neither in the realm of ideal forms nor in the world. The implication for rhetorical instruction is that invention, rather than just a reaction to topi, draws upon emotions, repressions, social context, and medium of communication, demonstrating why creative artistic work defies systematic modes of production, as each artistic work requires unique situational processes. As the work of Timaeus is to consider how to bring some of the ideal city into the world, perhaps the work of writers is to bring some of the subjectivity they would have into inscription. In her novel, Transparently Veiled Fictionalized Autobiography of the Samurai, Kristeva writes about an unhappily practicing psychoanalyst, Joel Cabarrus. She describes her patients as, quote, people who pay to be stupid and wicked, even contemptible in my presence, in the no less abject but touching hope of being reborn, of making a new life for themselves. And then later, quote, patients are failed or fledgling writers who have no readers. They are unskilled but bold, unquote. While Joel's profound unhappiness, even bitterness, make her an unreliable narrator, I take her words here at face value. Psychoanalytic patients are unsuccessful writers seeking rebirth. Further, writers seek rebirth. Or put another way, in the process of composition, writers take part in the composition not only of the text, but also their subjectivities. Then writing instruction should allow and provide choric invention, and writing instructors should read student writers semi-analytically. If this is true, then when writing instructors teach students how and what to write, we are giving and potentially limiting our students with ways of being. In an interview conducted in 1989 and originally published in 1990 in Discourse, Kristeva discusses the pedagogical implications of her theories regarding subjectivity, amongst many other subjects. The modern crisis began, Kristeva asserts, with the French Revolution, subsequent efforts of democracy and unsettling of authority, sexual identity, religion, and language have resulted in a culture with constantly altering structures of organization, a positive incarnation of anarchy. Kristeva's figure of cultural identity corresponds to her claim that the subject and process that we are ourselves only in the moment of articulation. Teachers then ought to view themselves as psychiatrists, psychologists, philosophers, and semiologists, guiding their students individually towards flexible forms of self-representation. Such a program naturally would require an advanced training for teachers and significantly more funding for education. Kristeva had, at the time of the interview, begun a program designed to enact such a training program focused on discrete disorders such as autism, the Diploma of Advanced Research on Psychopathology and Semiology, or DRAPS. A survey of the website for the University of Paris Siderat No. 7, where Kristeva taught since the early 1970s, lists no such degree path currently available, indicating to me that this degree path has since dissolved, if it ever occurred. The dissolution of DRAPS would not be a surprise. Even in her interview with Clark, Kristeva concedes that it would be terribly expensive and thus perhaps impractical. However, I would argue that such a program would turn power over to the educated public and threaten the extant hegemony, which is why it would inevitably be incinerated like Mayakovsky's poet. Here's what I want to say. Utterance and inscription amount to so much more than symbolic systems, and the act of writing, especially writing poetically, enacts new, radical subjectivities. Therefore, the work of the writing instructor, if done well, threatens the current power structure. Even though this power structure funds the university system, whether directly in the case of public institutions or indirectly through scholarship monies at private schools. Perhaps this is why so much has been done by policymakers, though I cannot speak to the degree of conscious intention involved, to systematize and thus castrate humanities education. The question then becomes, must humanities education exist in eternal temporality, like poetic language?
Well, good afternoon. The paper I'm reading today is part of a larger project that I'm working on in Victorian children's literature. And so it's distilled, so hopefully it'll still make sense. In Intimate Revolt, Julia Kristeva posits the necessity of cultivating and nurturing a language of revolt through experiences that open psychical life to infinite recreation, even at the price of errors and dead ends. A language that makes possible a jouissance that is indispensable to keeping the psyche alive. What I am proposing today is that imaginative children's literature offers readers this language of revolt through scripts of possibility, which allow for psychic experimentation free from prohibition and judgment. In short, that imaginative literature may offer a powerful means by which adolescents can engage with and in this language of revolt, to experiment with psychic constructs of self and to contribute to more resilient, mature subjects, less prone to the ideality syndrome. I want to begin by suggesting that the importance of Kristeva's theories for adolescence has not yet been sufficiently explored, especially in the context of children's literature. This morning, she referred to abjection as an essential stage in development of the psyche, and I would like to suggest that, similar to analysis, literature can enhance the development of subjects and process, especially in relationship to abjection, the energy or object that disturbs the norm. Rather than seeking solely to repress or deny abjection, acknowledging it can provide a potential source of creativity, growth, and change, thereby diffusing its threat to the symbolic order. Experimenting with one's relationship with abjection enables adolescent writers and readers to negotiate the boundaries between what their culture endorses or rejects, as well as the distance between those positions and their own emergent voices. Imaginatively engaging with alternative perspectives is essential for experiencing, not just intellectualizing, both ourselves in the other and the other in ourselves, and may prove vital for functioning in an increasingly diverse and complex life and community. Story, both as a way to construct the self and as a script of possibility, provides a means through which to sort experiences, experiment with identity, and posit potential psychic selves, as well as consolidate them. Adolescents are especially sensitive to these possible selves because of what Kristeva identifies as their open psychic structures, enabling engagement in as-if narratives free from judgment. Whether constructing one's own story and analysis or a text, the adolescent's open psyche enhances the ability to embrace other experiences, whether culturally recognized, endorsed, or determined abject. Certainly, writing enables the possibility of creating new narratives of oneself, but imaginative literature can also provide adolescent readers with possible scripts and a socially safe means by which to explore and experiment with their understanding of their own emerging selves. The explicit parallel that Kristeva posits between the Analysand's narrative and that of narrative fiction reveal the value of story to healthy identities as a, quote, complex psychological event. Artistic transference offers young readers this potential, and the freedom to engage imaginatively with abjection enables more secure yet flexible and fluid constructions of the self. Victorian Britain is an especially rich period in which to explore the language of revolt, the intersection of and tension between dominant values and the emerging and transforming identities define the era. The cultural upheavals of religious, economic, scientific, and social transformations disrupted any perception of a stable identity. For one of the first times in British history, a man's social position could change. He He could imagine a self different from the one positioned at birth, reimagine himself as middle class, realign his relationship to cultural power. In the midst of these unprecedented social redefinitions, imaginative children's literature emerged as an economically viable literary genre. Imaginative literature, fantasies, adventures, texts of escape and transformation, began to compete with texts designed less to entertain and enjoy than to reinforce religious perspectives and class distinctions in an effort to conserve values deemed necessary to maintain normative culture. As a scholar of the period's literature, I've become increasingly fascinated by how its imaginative literature for children illustrates both the culture's complexity and the role of the other, the abjected individual or energy. How these narratives could contribute to creating more resilient emerging subjects. Read through the lens of Kristeva's theory of the adolescent and subject formation, Victorian children's literature remains of value for today's readers, struggling with their own place in culture and their own sense of self. To this end, I want to use Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island and Frances Hodgson Burnett's Little Princess as comparative case studies of coming-of-age narratives that can serve as creative models for engaging in an intimate revolt that acknowledges and accommodates abjection. Both novels present gender-specific scripts that reinforce cultural values for young Victorian boys and girls. But both novels also include alternative scripts of experience that build upon the recognition of abjection as essential in reaching psychic maturity. Few books could rival the popularity of Treasure Island as a model to educate the Victorian boy toward his cultural position. Told in retrospect by Jim Hawkins, Treasure Island invites the emerging middle-class boy to accompany him on a journey toward maturity that is filled with activity, energy, adventure, and conquest. Despite traveling into a world of pirates and treasures, betrayal and deceit, the narrative assures the young reader that Jim not only survives the adventure, but gains greater cultural cachet as a result of those experiences. He achieves this by asserting cultural privilege as an authorized voice before narrating his adventures. Consequently, the reader knows that regardless of any forays into culturally questionable space, Jim will be reinscribed into an appropriate and recognizable position in culture, that Treasure Island offers him a safe means to experiment with constructs of himself. For Jim to achieve this healthy and integrated self, part of this maturation requires that he develop his own values rather than those simply parroted back of culture. That is, Jim must embrace a relative morality that comes from negotiating boundaries. As an adolescent, his psychic structure allows an openness to ambiguity because of a loosening of superego during this period. Consequently, through his adventures and tolerance of uncertainty, Jim learns to interpret a variety of signs and markers, at times even translating that growing knowledge for the reader, an event that may in turn facilitate the reader's growing understanding of the complexity of value. Jim gains this more sophisticated understanding largely through his ability to experiment with possible identities, to experience a psychic moratorium that allows him to try out a range of social subject positions, even quite extreme ones, before eventually becoming a more moderate, socially recognized subject. One benefit of adolescent psychic moratorium and the freedom that an open psychic structure provides is the ability to embrace what normative culture would name abject. Jim's experiences provide him with opportunities to recognize the creative, productive dimension of the abject. For instance, it is the culturally threatening lodger at his family's inn that propels the adventure to Treasure Island possessing the map. It is Jim's transgression of normative scripts as pirate, deserter, captain, even if for the larger good, that strengthen his confidence and support his emerging values. And it is his experience with longtime Maroon Ben Gunn, Abjection incarnate, that ultimately enabled Jim and his compatriots to triumph over the pirates of Treasure Island. Jim has learned to distinguish between corrupt signs and abjection charged with generative possibility. After inhabiting these countercultural positions, Jim must choose where to take his story. Long John Silver and his loyal pirates continue their affront on Dr. Livesey and the Squire in an effort to claim claim the treasure. But Jim has separated himself from either group, securing the pirate ship, learned where the treasure is, and procured a means of escape from the island. At this point in his narrative, he faces three options: to abandon himself to pure abjection like Gunn, to embrace a corrupted transposition of abjection with silver, or creatively tap into abjection sublime by using it to maneuver successfully in his culture's symbolic order. He has experimented with various identities and subject positions and has learned to interpret complex signs. Jim's experience with the maroon gun offers creative solutions to his crisis that enable him to move towards cultural engagement. He does not succumb to the abject, but taps into these experiences to reconnect with his cultural agents. Jim recounts his story to the doctor, contextualizing his apparent betrayal as necessary for their success, and in doing so, he gains approval from Dr. Livesey, who affirms that it was Jim that, quote, saves our life. Throughout the narrative, the doctor has functioned as Jim's beloved authority, facilitating his adventure and enabling his cultural integration. Jim's encounters with abjection have enabled him to creatively respond to dangerous and threatening experiences. He can tap into culturally questionable ideas to benefit that culture's survival. In this way, Jim offers Victorian boys their own treasure map of sorts, a path that offers an imaginative journey through possible subject positions, variously engaging with, resisting, and integrating abject energy. But what about the Victorian girl? Increasingly segregated gendered spheres prevented a sharing coming-of-age script for boys and girls. Just as needful, though, of a psychic moratorium, a space of psychic experimentation as their male counterparts, Victorian girls, however, were offered narratives that circumscribed their experimental subjects within a much more narrow space. In contrast to the adventurous narratives offered boys, scripts given to girls focused primarily on acculturating female domesticity. Young girls found restricted geographic and cultural space. Girls were also exposed to dynamics that encouraged stronger attachment to values and experience associated with the maternal. In short, girls were given scripts that circumscribed their paths toward participation in the symbolic, scripts that discouraged the necessary separation required for full participation. Imaginative literature, however, might create scripts of possibility, even if appearing to reinforce culturally privileged patterns of behavior. Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Little Princess demonstrates just this, a collection of as-if narratives that celebrate rather than suppress energy deemed abject by culture. Revising her earlier Sarah Crewe into this novel, Burnett tells Sarah's story as a young Victorian girl who, after suffering familial and financial loss, can reposition herself in space acknowledged by culture. Similar to Jim in Treasure Island, Sarah needs to find a position in culture, but Sarah, unlike Jim, begins in a more marginalized and abject position than he. Rather than leave England to experiment in a variety of scripts and play with abjection the way Jim does, Sarah is translocated to England from the exoticized India. As a result, she can only engage in possible scripts that are now confined either to her imagination or to a very small geographical space. As female and child, Sarah has a more tenuous relationship to the symbolic order. Her ability to translate her story into the symbolic is precarious as well. This may explain why, unlike Jim's adventure, Sarah Crewe's story is told for her by a non-character narrator. As an emerging subject, Sarah's relationship with normative values and cultural privilege depend upon our imagination. From our first introduction to her, we see that narrative is the means by which Sarah makes sense of the world. In this way, her participation in the symbolic is dependent upon creativity and non-symbolic energy, not simply as a source of possibility, but as a means to communicate her experiences. The degree to which she is outside of the symbolic order creates moments in which her own otherness is exaggerated. She fails to recognize the social distinctions her culture depends upon to secure control, either in terms of nationality or class. Sarah's mother had been French, and she befriends the scullery maid, Becky, despite being told by Miss Minchin that scullery maids are not little girls. She further destabilizes cultural codes by developing relationships with attic rats, the neighbor's monkey, and his servant from India, Ram Das. However, it is this very engagement with the abject that will eventually enable her participation in a recognized social space. Sarah continuously creates scripts that reshape her experience. These alternative narratives, ones that elevate as-if scripts, produce a contrapuntal story that functions concurrently with her culture's dominant order. These experiences enable her to interpret markers foreign to England's dominant order. She speaks not only French, but Hindustani. These simultaneous counter-narratives sustain Sarah despite her experiences of loneliness, isolation, and eventually poverty. Although imagined or recounted rather than written, these stories nonetheless illustrate Kristeva's description of the power of writing, or creating narrative as a practice that facilitates the ultimate reorganization of psychic space. An instance in the novel that literalizes this process occurs when Sarah attempts to confront the scullery-maid Becky, when they both suffer from cold in their harsh living conditions. Sarah explains, "What you have to do with your mind when your body is miserable is to make it think of something else, to dissolve into another space, to imaginatively transport yourself to another place or experience." Through her counter-narratives and engagement with socially abject individuals, Sarah sustains herself even as she resides in liminal space, what in The Power of Horror Kristeva describes as neither subject nor object, but a third space or border. It is Sarah's ability to permeate boundaries, linguistic, social, that provide her with possible scripts to reshape her relationship to normative culture, to construct counter-narratives that have acknowledged and sublimated abject desire. Over time, Sarah's already complicated relationship to her culture deteriorates. She is stripped of her social rank through the collapse of her father's finances. She is stripped of her familial place with her father's death. So she is psychically redefined as dependent servant and physically relocated to the attic rooms. This narrative development intensifies her already established association with the abject. Now named as dependent and with none of the cultural capital that her former social status provided, Sarah's otherness is reinterpreted as dangerous rather than tolerated as eccentricity. Consequently, she is denied any acknowledgement of value from those in power. She struggles to construct scripts to make meaning in a story for herself. Kristeva's comments upon such a crisis, noting that I am only if a beloved authority acknowledges me. For Sarah, not until she is valued by an acculturated authority can she fully participate in that domain. Alternative authorities begin to provide this after Mr. Carrisford, a recent transplant from India himself, moves next door. Carrisford establishes a productive relationship between Sarah and himself because he, and especially Ram Dass, recognizes and knows how to understand her. She must be heard. Her story cannot be dismissed, censored, or foreclosed to become psychically healthy. Her individual fantasies, as Kristeva names such imaginative constructs, must evade the judgment of others. She must be loved and accepted, recognized as having value. With these new relationships, she can re-engage in a dynamic process as an emerging subject. And it is through her ability to validate what culture dismisses or marginalizes that allows this to happen. Because of her developing relationship with her neighbor Carrisford, he learns that she is in fact the daughter of his partner, the result of which is that Sarah is repositioned into a culturally inscribed place of value where she can be acknowledged and valued. Validated by those who interpret and value her, Sarah can be read as functioning in multiple symbolic orders, initially the French, subsequently the Indian. These concurrent identities, at once central and marginal, depending upon one's position, defy a primarily linear pattern of subject development towards psychic maturity and social engagement. And as a result, the distinctions between normative and abject, imaginative reality and communal reality collapse. At the conclusion of her narrative, Sarah locates herself in a viable position that honors her imaginative potential even as it functions within culturally recognized space. Perhaps what Sarah demonstrates and A Little Princess offers is a radical revisioning of cultural space where difference is accepted and binaries are dissolved. In this way, imaginative literature offers the young reader not only scripts of alternative experience, but also models of integrated dynamic relationships of various values, and energy. Engagement with narrative, experimenting with a variety of possible scripts, can function in a way similar to psychoanalysis by reawakening the imagination, enabling identification and detachment, healthy psychic functioning that is open to new possibilities. Imagination, Kristeva affirms in Tales of Love, is a means through which one empathizes, is a discourse of love that can resolve crises, narcissism, and fear. Being offered possibility rather than prohibition, experiencing the other in ourselves, and feeling a connection beyond ourselves as a result, adolescents benefit immensely from imaginative opportunities. Recognizing a richer complexity of potential choices and recognizing empathetic feelings, adolescents may gain insight into themselves, their desires, and their needs. Imaginative practice, then, serves much more than a diversion or a distraction. Imaginative activity, here literature, serves as a vital cultural function for enabling optimum psychic health and more resilient individuals. Thank you.
I've renamed my paper, but it's still on the same topic, so never fear. The new title is Patient Interpretation, Kristeva's Model for the Caregiver. I use Julia Kristeva's work in Hatred and Forgiveness to encourage new thinking and medical ethics. My discussion pertains to the relationship between medical professionals and patients in clinical practice. Many of those working in the medical humanities recognize that patients contend with issues of identity and the collapse of meaning as a result of the disruptions of illness. Some medical humanists have suggested that medical professionals should practice tolerance for imperfection and see oneself and one's patients in order to better care for those who are tangled in these experiences. In their practice, medical professionals seek to bridge the gap between themselves and their patients in precisely this way. Yet they struggle to identify with their patients and can even be disgusted by them or experience the desire to reject them. I argue that what is needed is a dialogical rather than a projective model by which the medical professional can interact with the patient on a level other than the merely somatic or diagnostic. Kristeva can teach medical professionals to be patient interpreters engaged in a dialogical narrative building that would improve caregiving. She writes, healing? Yes, provided we do not forget that healing involves psychological rebirth. In what follows, I'll describe the medical humanities, link it to narrative ethics, and then show how Kristeva can provide a model of patient interpretation for medical professionals. The medical humanities is a growing field of interdisciplinary concern. Through reflections on cultural artifacts of all kinds, including art, novels, archival ephemera, and poetry, academics and medical professionals seek a supplement or even a set of alternatives to the diagnostic discourse of medicine. These reflections are meant to bridge gaps between medical professionals and patients. The medical humanities attempts to bring the arts back into the medical arts and to understand medicine as a complex healing practice. Alan Peterkin, assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, believes the medical humanities can provide an antidote for the near worship at the altar of evidence-based medicine by, quote, creating a space for creative reflection and for thinking and feeling. Peterkin reminds his readers that medicine is not the only field that deals with suffering, and in consequence, medical professionals can learn much from other fields, including the fine arts, writing, and history, that will help them treat patients. Peterkin writes, we work every day with patients who struggle to find new meaning in the face of illness. They expect us to offer guidance. True healers have always used images, music, and poems to help find the way. Little by little, these and many other creative tools are finding their way back into our black bags. The medical humanities is therefore a route toward compassionate patient care. Ideally, this compassionate patient care would take the suffering of the patient and the patient's search for new meaning seriously as a part of healing or caregiving. And I'm arguing that experiencing the disruptions of illness and searching for new meaning will involve some kind of narrative building for the patient. Increasingly, narrative ethics has taken up the question of the role of stories in moral life. For philosopher Hildy Lindemann Nelson, there are several narrative approaches relevant for medical contexts. Primarily of use in the medical humanities is the practice of reading stories. reading stories can result in a kind of moral education, drawing, quote, one's attention to the rich and subtle particulars of the narrative, the moral, intellectual, emotional, and social nuances. But narrative ethics also involves telling stories, and we can correctly read the bioethics case presentation as storytelling. Indeed, Todd Chambers argues that the bioethics case is its own genre. Meanwhile, the established bioethical practice of casuistry, which compares bioethics cases and establishes paradigm and analogous cases, can be read as a type of narrative ethics. And narrative ethics can also amount to literary analysis, a practice that would vary based on what's taken as the text. Finally, we could talk about invoking stories to make philosophical or moral points. So for the purposes of this essay, I use a multifaceted narrative approach. I seek to highlight the patient's need to construct new meanings in the face of the disruptions of illness. I characterize the patient as a text in need of interpretation. This is a shift in genre. I depart from the bioethics case, which is told in monologue after a case is closed, in favor of shared storytelling as a core process of care. In this way, I combine the concerns of the medical humanities and narrative ethics, while at the same time pointing to how Kristeva would describe an opening for healing in a fuller sense, one that is both psychical and somatic, and refuses to reify the primary dualism of the body-soul, and that's how she's described it in Hatred and Forgiveness. I therefore also engage in the most primary form of narrative ethics in the medical humanities. I read Kristeva's stories from analysis in order to enrich the medical humanities. I argue that dialogical storytelling is a key part of compassionate patient care, but medical professionals are in need of a nuanced model to follow. In Kristeva's discussion of patient interpretation in Hatred and Forgiveness, I find a promising model. In invoking her model, I use two meanings of the phrase patient interpretation, as she was likely trying to also do, but I'm not sure because it wasn't her English phrase. So. In Hatred and Forgiveness, Kristeva discusses links between cancer and depression and expresses, as those working in the medical humanities do, a wish for an era when doctors could write, she says, like Chekhov or Celine. She wants this because she claims that now, more than ever, doctors need to meet their patients' psychical needs. According to Kristeva, more and more, and this is a quote, slowing the progression of cancer, which has been achieved over the past few years, and stopping it have led medical professionals to become involved in the psychical context of illness, to assist the patient in overcoming the depression that has either preceded the appearance of the cancer or developed after its appearance. She wryly notes that medical professionals are encroaching on psychoanalysis, but seems to not altogether hate the idea. For Kristeva, the cared-for caregiver dyad necessarily involves transference and countertransference. But Kristeva, of course, worries that medical professionals are not trained to deal with this and will not be able to provide what the patient needs. That is what Kristeva calls the space of revolt, where the patient can go about reestablishing ties, such as the narcissistic image and erotic ties. Transference should be, quote, contained and oriented toward a specific psychotherapy, end quote. And Kristeva wonders, quote, how do we prepare medical personnel for this goal? Without an answer to that grander question, of course, she prescribes benevolent listening in cases especially of terminal illness. She writes, the dying person expects not so much a response as to be heard. She does not want doctors to behave as if they were psychoanalysts, but seems to want them to practice what she calls psychical availability. She wants doctors, quote, at the very least to read novels. In this way, Kristeva joins the chorus of those working within the medical humanities and narrative ethics. But how, beyond reading novels, can one develop benevolent listening in the clinic? What exactly is benevolent listening? To venture an answer, I turn to Kristeva's discussion of Pierre, whose paranoid hatred led Kristeva to write Powers of Horror and to reflect on her psychoanalytic practice in Hatred and Forgiveness. In her roles as analyst and writer, Kristeva reads the stories of her Analysands by listening and goes on to both tell and evoke those stories in her writings. Pierre's story and Kristeva's subsequent reflection can provide a model of benevolent listening of use in medical context, and this will eventually be what I'm calling patient interpretation. Kristeva writes, Pierre was a difficult patient I hesitated taking on. His raging hatred, which would one day necessarily be turned against me, scared me less than his narcissistic close-mindedness. It made his insights, superficial, bookish, and insignificant in fact, clever defenses that prevented any questioning of the self. At times he hated himself as much as he hated others, but he never questioned himself. End quote. Kristeva notices that Pierre solicited her through transference to be both abject mother and Oedipal father. The multiple roles Kristeva was called upon to play must match in intensity that of the role of the caregiver who's treating a dying patient. Indeed, Kristeva portrays Pierre as almost drowning. He was, quote, pouring out torrents of pure hatred, meaning not in any way ambivalent, she says, against those who he perceived to be persecuting him with hatred. She describes herself as unsure what to do and also somewhat overtaken by his hatred. She writes, I felt persecuted in turn. Not only did Pierre end up convincing me of the ugliness of people and of the world in which we lived, but his wife had already made the interpretations that were on the tip of my tongue. Did he come to consult me in order to prevent me from speaking out of hatred of analysis? Or else was he revealing the unbearable truth of the speaking being whose hatred uncovers what was concealed? Much as the medical professional is reminded of mortality through working with a dying patient, Kristeva is here reminded of original repression. Both deal with the limitations of subjectivity and ultimately abjection, which is covered over and constitutes that original repression. For Kristeva, hatred like Pierre's is built upon abjection. We need abjection to confine our subjectivity. Abjection is the first step towards subjectivity. Kristeva writes, the abject and abjection are my guardrails. So in a psychosomatic avant-garde of the future Oedipal revolt, that's her wording, the subject is, quote, driven to expel my progenitors, and in this way I begin to create my own territory bordered by the abject. But the inaugural abjection of the subject can go badly wrong, she says, subverted by hatred, avoid, phobia, and can imprison the subject or perhaps end in what Pierre is experiencing, paranoid hatred. But Pierre is eventually able to speak with Kristeva about his shame, his bodily shame, begin painting, and terminate analysis. Kristeva notes that his hatred did not disappear but became, over the course of treatment, she writes, less invasive. How did Kristeva help him accomplish these results? She tells Pierre's story to explicate and invoke not only a life lived in paranoid hatred, but also to describe her response to it. A response which she claims helped her outline her conception of psychoanalysis. She explains that she did not respond with love or hate, but instead gave a gift of, quote, patient interpretation of the psychical movements subjacent to his state of war. She broke the chain of persecutions in which his psychical negativity had been stuck and inserted it into the openness of psychical time, the gift of a new way of being, end quote. This patient interpretation, which is somewhat at a remove by refusing to be engaged by either love or hatred, gave Pierre a new psychic temporality. She calls this gift the pardon of interpretation and paints interpretation as, quote, a postmodern version of forgiveness. Her response to Pierre, the forgiveness of psychoanalysis, her patient interpretation, is the model of benevolent listening and therefore patient care I seek. Kristeva posits that forgiveness was initially offered by religion, but religion rewrote hatred as sin and offered forgiveness only through godly authority. She writes, quote, through forgiveness, time for vengeance is suspended, allowing a rebirth before the metamorphoses of abjection begin again. Psychoanalysis for Kristeva replaces religion's style of forgiveness with a new version. It offers forgiveness without calling hatred sin and without referring to an absolute power. So she starts describing the Freudian sort of revolution, which would offer, quote, the interpretation of variants of hatred that feed a symptom, so this sort of iterative interpretation, invented to stop the time of judging in the name of the dogma of love, of God or our fellow man. So non-judgmental. Religion and now psychoanalysis, quote, corresponds to a vital need in the speaking being, that of opening up psychical time, quote. And again, this can happen because of this sort of post-moral forgiveness that she thinks renews the unconscious. So it's this temporality. There's a temporality here that's opened up via this sort of detached forgiveness. Using Kristeva's reaction to Pierre, I now turn to draw an analogy between what Kristeva does for Analysands and what a medical professional might do for her patient. Like Kristeva, I realize that medical professionals, unless trained, should not engage in psychoanalysis. Yet they can engage in benevolent listening that takes cues from psychoanalytic practice. Given the intimacy of the relationship between caregivers and the cared for, this seems more than appropriate. In fact, responding to patient needs seems to require it. So Kristeva hesitated to take Pierre as an analysand, taken aback by his narcissism and his hatred, and in the same way, physicians can recoil from their patients. Medical humanist Johanna Shapiro writes, "When someone is sick, disabled, in pain, hurt, or dying, medicine expects an altruistic impulse from the physician." End quote. But this altruistic impulse is rarely the first response. With reference to Kristeva's concept of abjection, Shapiro writes, "The impulse to draw closer, to become engaged and connected with the suffering other, is far from automatic. We have an equal, if not stronger, and opposite impulse to draw back, detach, and separate from the contamination of illness." Quote. Illness calls up abjection, placing our leaky boundaries and borders in sharp relief and issuing an unsettling challenge to the exclusions required by subjectivity. Abjection threatens to overwhelm us and unmake our subjectivity in the clinical encounter, whether we are ill or those we love are ill. To heal, we need a psychical as well as a somatic intervention. The destruction and dissolution of our boundaries require a kind of reconstitution of the self, and it seems that we might achieve this through storytelling. But this storytelling requires openness on the part of the caregiver, that benevolent listening. As Kristeva points out, those who are ill, especially the terminally ill, want to be heard. She speaks elsewhere of something she calls a psychoanalytic listening to vulnerability. As phenomenologists like Richard Zahner have noted, there's a fundamental asymmetry among those who encounter each other in the clinic. The physician is powerful and the patient is vulnerable. Kristeva describes the dynamic in this way. Quote, "The attending physician is invested with the supreme power of the subject supposed to know," in italics, the subject supposed to know. A more amorous transference then passes to a new power. The doctor is the possessor of life and therefore of the mystery of death. Quote. I posit that the medical professional, the caregiver, must allow the patient, the cared for, to speak, even against the master discourse of diagnosis and the physician's own desire to recoil. More than that, the caregiver must provide patient interpretation the way Kristeva did for Pierre. That is not a response of love or hate, but rather non-judgmental, continuous, or maybe iterative, maybe a better word here again, acknowledgement of the utterances of the patient. It's benevolent listening. So benevolent listening is both patient interpretation in Kristeva's original sense of generously giving time, and patient interpretation in a second sense, that is reading the patient as a text, which is desirable only if it's achieved through benevolent listening. While this practice cannot be taught, only modeled, it is a skill medical professionals can enact and develop. Perhaps benevolent listening in the clinic, like psychoanalysis, opens up psychical time and allows space for the patient to be cared for. So in conclusion, the medical humanities seeks ways to connect medical professionals with patients and thereby reintegrate, in a sense, psychical life and biological life. Kristeva notes that there's no such thing as life without psychical life, and so no somatic healing without psychical healing. The hope in the medical humanities is that new practices of reflection and care will foster patient expression and recognize multiple sources of meaning, while simultaneously breaking the stranglehold of the authoritative master logic of diagnostic criteria and purely somatic understandings of disease. Kristeva can help make sense of medical encounters and bring a fresh lens to the medical humanities by offering this model of listening, benevolent psychoanalytic listening to vulnerability that opens itself up to patient utterances, and perhaps can create the conditions for the kind of dialogical storytelling that's reconstitutive of the subject. Thank you.
Yes, so I guess we'll open it up. Sure.
Thank you. My question's for Melinda. I wrote something on trying to compare kind of like the talking cure in Kristeva to diagnostic discourse recently. So
Oh, cool.
now I'll ask you the thing that I couldn't figure out.
Oh.
Well, so I found myself often getting stuck with making this contrast.
Yeah.
Because I was observing how for many people their relationship to the diagnosis, it was hard for me at sometimes to disentangle that from kind of a narrative.
Mhm.
Because if we call diagnostic discourse something like authoritative master logic, like following Foucault, which I think it is at a certain level, that might miss this kind of phenomenon where people really, identify with a diagnosis. And this is fleshed out nicely by, I'm forgetting the book, but when people don't have a diagnosis for a long time, when they finally get that diagnosis, there's some sense of kind of, this important identification and kind of finding one's self in that. So you see the question I'm asking, do you want to hold on to kind of a sharp distinction, or do you think we should hold on to a sharp distinction between diagnosis and kind of my own narrative?
Yeah, I think I would like to hold on to the distinction, although I certainly think you're right that a lot of people do find, for example, freedom in a diagnosis. And when you were talking, I was thinking about John Elder Robison's memoir about having Asperger's and not knowing until he was an adult that there was such a diagnosis. But even in mentioning his memoir, I'm thinking of how actually now the new version of the DSM doesn't have that designation anymore, right? And it's been reintegrated into the autism spectrum disorder. And I don't really see people dropping the words. Like lots of people still say, oh, I'm an Aspie, I identify that way. That's my group, we're Aspies. And so I'm not sure, well, anyway, the reason I'd like to hold on to the distinction is that it does seem to me that a lot of times the practice of diagnosis is just a sort of a narrative that is like a scan over what's actually happening to the patient, right? There's just this narrative, and you can dip in and out and like feel good about your diagnosis sometimes and not other times, but there's always kind of a rubbing or a back and forth where it's really just not exactly what you might want it to be. And also I think it's important to hold the distinction or think about diagnosis as a master logic, because lots of times the withholding of diagnosis from patients can be really damaging and disturbing in the way that a master discourse might withhold.
Totally.
So I'm thinking about not cystic fibrosis, endometriosis, and situations like, what am I thinking of? The pain, fibromyalgia.
Yeah.
That, and doctors say, oh, that's not a diagnosis. That's not a thing. Like I'll tell you you have that to get you out of my clinic, and maybe I'll give you some medicine. And so there's this withholding pattern where people kind of get either validated or not validated by that discourse, and so I like thinking of it as pretty authoritarian still.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a question for Mary Marley. I like your paper very much, and I wonder about the idea of idea in terms of Plato, and in that perspective, how could you comment this punishment of the poetry, mimetic poetry, in the end of the law? Are you trying to reinscribe it?
To reinscribe poetry?
Yeah, because in the end of the law, mimetic
Of Plato's laws.
Mhm.
This is what the
Yeah,
Plato-
yeah.
Plato's description of poetry is not the final law on what poetry is, in
No,
my
I
opinion.
Yeah, he does not get to tell me what poetry is. And I have very firm opinions on what it is, and I have a sense of what how Kristeva uses it. And it is his description of, as I've understood the function of the poetic for Plato, it's very different. He in what I have read of his dialogues, he seems to treat it as, similar to the rhetorical tradition, as this sort of decorative ornament, potentially a distraction from real truth. And that's because he valorizes, to use that critically abused term, the ideal. And I think part of the work of rhetoricians, and it's valuable, is to, especially the current movement and rhetoric that I kind of talked about briefly, is to also assert the value of embodiment. And that's what poetic is. Poetic is when a speaker or a writer attempts to take form, the form of words, either spoken or written, and that form embodies the meaning, not just in terms of sign, but in terms of sound and viewing, and it creates a fuzziness in this idea that there is this arbitrary distinction, there's this arbitrary connection between sign and signifier. Sometimes it does not feel that way so much. Sometimes we have poetry, and it seems to actually evoke that real truth. And maybe it's because it's embodied, and maybe it's because the embodied truth is at least as valuable as getting.
Go ahead.
I have a question for Ruth. It's actually kind of a double question, but I think it might be related. So I was wondering if you thought other modes could offer the space for like an adolescent psychic moratorium and everything you're describing. So say, for example, movies, television shows, anime, or if there's something about literature and its connection to language or something that makes it specific. And secondly, do we have to make judgments about, I don't know how to put this, like the quality of the writing or the intention of the writing? So with the Robert Louis Stevenson example, you said one of the reasons it was effective is because Jim tells us in the beginning, I survived this whole story you're going to hear, so that the reader going into it knows that he, presumably the adolescent boy, is going to be safe. Like if that weren't the case, would it be a kind of disruptive chaos? Do we have to kind of make judgments about what children's literature would be good?
Starting with the last question.
Sure.
I don't think we need to have those, we don't need to know that in advance. One of the things I was trying to do in the larger version was talk about how Jim, from the very beginning, is already authorized to tell this story, because part of that is, he goes on to say, Dr. Livesey told me I should tell this story, and so it's set up that way, and so that was in part to create a distinction to Sarah, whose voice is pretty submerged in a lot of ways. So I think, though, that it does on one level sort of reinforces cultural values a little bit more, because he's already, as a speaker, he's already back in culture. And so I don't know the degree to which that would really make a difference. And as far as the other, I'd have to think more about it, but I think that there would be a lot of different means by which this could happen, because if we look at the idea of narrative of story, and then experience, I would think that certainly, I mean, I don't think it needs to necessarily be even, canonized children's literature. I mean, I think that any kind of adventure, any experience, any opportunity for that kind of imaginative experience, and the opportunity to try on those options in a way, or identify to a degree, would serve that purpose. But I really haven't thought that much about it yet.
I also have a question for Ruth. Thank you. So I heard you talking about how those who receive eventual cultural inscription, like Jim and Sarah, do so by traveling to realms of the abject, or like you called it, the abjection incarnate, or spaces where the normative and the abject collapse. And I'm just wondering what kind of potentially worrisome educative implications that could have for those who don't receive eventual cultural inscription, or what that visit to the abject, so kinds of concerns that have been voiced in post-colonial theory about instrumentalization of the abject and that kind of thing.
Right.
What implications that might have.
Right. I think that's such a good question, because in part it gets to the heart of why I would argue children, adolescents, young people need to have opportunities to try out and experiment. Because if someone is writing a story, reading a story, you can go pretty far toward objection and still be fine, right? The difference is one of the things that Kristeva talks about is how it, in a way, or other ideas about how it relieves some of that desire to do that in real life, basically. There's been some research that suggests that if you can work through these ideas and these concerns imaginatively, you're less likely to need to do this literally. So this has been studies that connect with things like Columbine and those kind of issues. But I think that with Jim, for instance, Jim on the island, the place that he gains the most is with Ben Gunn, who is been there for years. Jim doesn't even recognize him as human initially, doesn't understand what he's saying, and eventually, but he's the one that has kind of collected the treasure, has the boat. So it's this place where it's as far from culture as you can get, that he's able to get what he needs to survive. So then he is faced with choices. What do you do after you've been there? You can choose to stay, which would not be healthy, right? You can choose to become a pirate, which is still playing with objection, but at least it's a recognized path. Or you could go back to your original place in culture, which is what he chooses to do. So it's as if his story gives these opportunities of, okay, what do you do, when you're here? Yes, there's something safe and good and rich about going to this space, but unless you want to end up like Ben Gunn, you've got to come back out, and then you still have to choose. But he's learned how to better read the markers that because he doesn't, when he first meets Long John Silver, he is convinced he's the most moral, wonderful guy on earth because he doesn't know how to read pirates. And so he doesn't look like what he thinks a corrupt person would look like. But over the course of the experience, he begins to recognize those markers. So I think it's a great question.
So I have a question for Mary. I'm very much in sympathy with both the critical and projective, how should we call it, part of your text. So I want to make sure I correctly understand the project that's there, because there is a sort of pedagogical utopia in it. So would you believe that it would be good if we had a position which is in between the teacher and the psychoanalyst? So it would be someone who would be as personally involved with progress, the development, the search for perfection in the student as the psychoanalyst is interested in succeeding with the patient, but on the other hand, it would not be dealing simply with resolving personal traumatic issues, but rather with a number of things like, of course, being a sort of mediator for whatever the history of our civilization has to offer, and the knowledge and the techniques. So it would be also concerned with form, and then finally it would be concerned with the development of a creative potential. And that, unfortunately, of course, we live in a society which is interested in this type of work, which would give the chance to every individual to develop fully their potential, because with whatever, I'm doing other things. So just to make sure that this is the
I really, in many ways, I do think this is the work of a teacher, and I think the issue is the issue of time, and it is resources.
Yeah.
How many, I think we have many people who could be teachers or who would be teachers, and classes, especially writing classes, especially humanities classes, should be small, so that we can have this conversation. And I will say there is a site, I know at my institution, the Writing Center, where, you know, you have tutors and they can assume this position somewhat. I have an ongoing session, for example, with a student. She's identified as having some sort of autism spectrum disorder, but she's very intelligent. She's taking writing though. She's a 4th year freshman, and she's taking a writing course for the 3rd time. And we've had this ongoing long-term appointment, and we've been working on articulation of her ideas, because they're definitely there. And I've been able to help her sort through this creative process. And I think that I'm not alone in my ability to do this. I think people can. And like I said, it's a matter of, you know, part of it is valuing and making time and space for the people who are teaching to do this, not just to perform the operation of the teacher of grading and taking in the test and taking in the paper and signing the grade and justifying it in some way and handing it back, but really making sure that engagement is happening.
Yeah, but we find the resources when people break down and when they go crazy and when they become
And this
criminals. So we have psychiatric institutions, and we have prisons, and we have this sort of thing, but nobody really wants to think that all this could be avoided and prevented by a different type of education. So yeah. Yes.
Agree. There's it's utopian thinking because it's so far from where we're at right now. But there is room for radical reconceptualization